was coming down in sheets against the windshield of my old Buick. The kind of heavy Georgia downpour that makes you feel like the world is trying to wash everything away. I sat in the driveway of the house I had lived in for 40 years, my hands trembling so hard I could barely keep them on the steering wheel. On the passenger seat sat a single cardboard box, everything I had left of a life I thought was secure. My son David stood on the porch of that same house, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wasn't wearing a jacket, and his face was a mask of cold stone. Beside him stood Chloe, his wife of 6 months, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. I rolled down the window just an inch, the damp air smelling of wet pine and regret. "David, please," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories. "It's middle of the night. Where am I supposed to go?" David didn't look at me. He looked at the driveway, at the puddles, at anything but the woman who had sacrificed every dream she ever had to make sure he had a future. He had been my whole world since his father passed away when he was only 5. I had worked 2 jobs, wore shoes with holes in them, and skipped. Chloe leaned in and whispered something into his ear. I saw his jaw tighten. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "Chloe needs her space, Mom. This is our home now. You signed the papers. You knew this was coming." The words felt like shards of glass in my chest. Yes, I had signed the papers. I had signed the house over to him as a wedding gift, thinking I was securing his legacy, never dreaming for a second that my legacy didn't include a room for me. I looked at the front door, the one I used to decorate with wreaths every Christmas, and realized the locks had already been changed. I put the car in reverse, my vision blurred by tears that were far more painful than the rain. As I backed out, I saw the porch light flicker and die, plunging David and his new life into darkness. I drove until the gas light came on, eventually pulling into a rest stop on I-75. As I sat there, clutching a tattered photo of David as a toddler, a realization hit me that made my blood run cold. I reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the legal folder David had given me to simplify my finances. My hands shook as I flipped to the last page of the bank statement. The balance wasn't just low, it was 0. Every cent of the silence of that rest stop was deafening. I stared at that bank statement until the numbers blurred into meaningless ink. Over $60,000, my late husband's life insurance, my small pension, the emergency fund I had spent 30 years building, had vanished. I remembered David telling me, just weeks after the wedding, that he had moved the money into a high-yield account to make it work harder for me. I had trusted him. He was my son. He was the boy I'd tucked in every night, the man I'd cheered for at every graduation. I looked at my phone. It was 3:15 a.m. I hit David's contact, my thumb hovering over the call button. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could let this happen, or if he even knew what Chloe was doing. Because deep down, I blamed her. I had to. The alternative, that my own flesh and blood had robbed me, was a thought I wasn't strong enough to carry yet. I pressed call. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. On the third try, the call was declined instantly. A text message popped up a second later. "Stop calling, Mom. We're sleeping. We'll talk when you've calmed down." I didn't feel like I needed to calm down. I felt like I was disappearing. I looked at the box on my seat. It contained my mother's pearls, a few old journals, and a heavy iron key I'd kept in the back of my jewelry box for decades. It was a key David had never seen, and one I had almost forgotten about. It belonged to a small storage unit in a town 2 hours north, a place I hadn't visited since David was a child. I checked my purse. I had $22 in cash and a quarter tank of gas. I had no home, no savings, and a son who treated me like a nuisance. He'd finally cleared off his porch. I started the engine, the Buick groaning as it came back to life. I had to get to that storage unit. It was the only thing David hadn't touched, mostly because he didn't know it existed. As I pulled back onto the highway, a black SUV pulled out from the shadows of the rest stop, following a few car lengths behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, but after 10 miles of lane changes and varying speeds, the SUV stayed right there, a constant pair of predatory eyes in my rearview mirror. Just as I approached the exit for the old storage facility, the SUV accelerated, swerving violently in front of me and slamming on its brakes, forcing me onto the muddy shoulder of the road. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The Buick skidded, the tires spinning in the Georgia red clay, before finally coming to a halt just inches from a drainage ditch. I sat there, gasping for air, as the driver's door of the black SUV opened. A tall figure stepped out, shielded by an umbrella. For a fleeting second, I thought it was David. I thought he had regretted everything and chased me down to bring me home. But as the figure approached my window and tapped on the glass with a heavy ring, I realized it wasn't David. It was a man I hadn't seen in 20 years, Chloe's father, Marcus. He was a man who dealt in investments and lived in a mansion that always felt too quiet. He signaled for me to roll down the window. "Mildred," he said, his voice as smooth as oil, "you left in such a hurry. David and Chloe are worried sick. They realized you took a certain folder with you, a folder that belongs to the estate." I clutched my bag to my chest. "The folder with my empty bank statements, Marcus. Is that what they're worried about? Or the fact that David threw his mother out in a storm?" Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, his eyes cold and calculating. "Let's not be dramatic. David is just trying to protect his future. And that folder contains some private documents regarding the house transfer that weren't meant for your eyes. Why don't you hand it over and I'll make sure you have a nice hotel room for the week. No need to sleep in a Buick. He wasn't asking. It was a threat wrapped in a bribe. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The humble grandma, who always kept the peace, felt a spark of the woman I used to be, the woman who had survived widowhood and poverty. I knew if Marcus wanted that folder, it meant there was something in it more valuable than a zero-balance statement. I don't have it, I lied, my voice remarkably steady. I dropped it at the rest stop. I must have left it on the bench. Marcus stared at me, searching for a tell. The silence stretched until the sound of a distant siren echoed through the trees. He straightened up, his lip curling. I'll go look for it then. But Mildred, don't go looking for things that don't belong to you. David made his choice. Respect it. He got back into his SUV and sped off toward the rest stop. I didn't wait. I floored the gas, the Buick fishtailing before catching pavement. I reached the storage facility 10 minutes later, my hands shaking as I fit the old iron key into the rusted lock of Unit 402. The door screeched open, revealing a mountain of dust and old furniture. I pushed past a moth-eaten sofa to a small floor safe hidden under a tarp. I punched in the code David's birthday. The safe clicked. Inside wasn't money. It was a stack of letters from my late husband and a digital drive I'd saved years ago. I plugged the drive into my old laptop, and as the files loaded, my breath hitched. It wasn't just my money that was gone. David hadn't just taken the house. He had been selling off parts of my husband's secret patents for years. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was a video file labeled, "For David to be opened on his 30th birthday." David was 31. He had never seen this. I clicked play, and the image of my husband, looking tired but determined, filled the screen. "Mildred," his voice came through the speakers, "if you're watching this, it means David has failed the test." I sat on a dusty crate. The blue light of the laptop screened the only illumination in the cramped storage unit. My husband, Arthur, looked so young on the screen, so full of the life that had been stolen from him by a sudden heart attack. Seeing him felt like a ghost reaching out to touch my hand. "I know how much you love him, Millie," Arthur's voice continued, crackling with age. "And I know you'll give him everything. That's your nature. But David has a streak in him, a hunger for things he hasn't earned. I've seen it even now, while he's just a boy. That's why the house and the main accounts are only the surface. If he's turned out to be the man I fear he might become under the wrong influence, he'll think he's taken it all. He'll think he's left you with nothing." I wiped a tear from my cheek. How had Arthur known? How had he seen the seeds of this betrayal 25 years before it happened? "The papers you signed to give him the house." Arthur's image gave a sad, knowing smile. "Check the secondary deed recorded in the county archives of 1998. There's a clause, Mildred. A life estate clause David's lawyers must have missed because I buried it in the original land grant. He can own the walls, but he cannot legally evict you as long as you draw breath. But more importantly, look behind the family portrait in the study. Not the frame, but the wall itself. The video ended abruptly. I stared at the dark screen. Arthur had built a failsafe. He had known that David's ambition might one day outweigh his love for his mother. But David hadn't acted alone. Chloe and Marcus had clearly been the ones to push him over the edge, to convince him that his mother was an anchor dragging him down. I looked at the folder again. The one Marcus was so desperate to get back. I looked closer at the house transfer documents. There it was, in tiny, archaic print. Subject to the irrevocable right of residency for Mildred A. Vance. David had illegally evicted me from a home he didn't have full control over. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of the storage unit groaned. I froze, slamming the laptop shut. A shadow fell across the concrete floor. I knew the rest stop story was a lie. Mildred, Marcus's voice boomed. He wasn't holding an umbrella anymore. He was holding a heavy flashlight, shining it directly into my eyes. You were always too sentimental. I figured you'd come here to cry over your husband's old junk. He stepped into the unit, his eyes landing on the open floor safe. Now, why don't you make this easy? Give me the drive, and we can all go back to pretending we're a happy family. David doesn't want to hurt you, but Chloe. Well, Chloe gets what she wants. I stood up, holding the laptop like a shield. You're using my son, Marcus. You're turning him into a thief. He was already a thief, Marcus laughed, a cold, dry sound. We just gave him a reason to be good at it. Now, give me the drive. He reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped back, my heel catching on the edge of the old sofa. As I fell, I grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a nearby table and swung it with everything I had. It struck the side of his head, and he grunted, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if he was down. I scrambled out of the unit, locked the door from the outside with the iron key, and ran for the Buick. I sped out of the facility, my heart drumming. I had to get back to the house. I had to get behind that portrait. But as I reached the main road, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a FaceTime call from David. I answered it, and my breath stopped. David was sitting in his living room, his head in his hands. Behind him, I could see 2 police officers walking through my kitchen, and Chloe was screaming in the background about a stolen heirloom. Mom, David's voice was shaky. Where are you? The police are here. Chloe says you stole her engagement diamonds before you left. The audacity of the lie was so breathtaking, I almost drove off the road. I stole her diamonds. I repeated, my voice trembling with rage. David, I left that house with 1 cardboard box and the clothes on my back. You watched me leave. You stood there and let her throw me out in a storm. She says they were in a blue velvet box in the safe. Mom, she says you're the only one who had the code. David sounded frantic, caught between the woman he'd married and the mother who had raised him. The police want to talk to you. If you don't come back and clear this up, they're going to issue a warrant. Just, just bring them back, and we can settle this quietly. Please, don't make this worse than it already is. I'm coming back, David, I said, my voice turning cold and hard. But not to return anything. I'm coming to take back what's mine. I hung up before he could respond. I knew what they were doing. They weren't just taking my money and my home. They were trying to put me in a cage so I could never speak the truth. If I was a thief, no one would believe my story about the stolen retirement funds. It was a classic Marcus move: strike first, ruin the reputation, and bury the victim. I drove back toward the house, my mind racing. I had the drive. I had the knowledge of the life estate clause, but I needed the physical proof Arthur had hidden behind the portrait. If I could get into that house and find whatever was in that wall, I wouldn't just be able to stay. I'd be able to dismantle the lies Marcus and Chloe had built. As I turned onto my street, I saw the flashing blue lights of a patrol car in my driveway. My neighbors were peering through their curtains, whispering about the crazy old Mrs. Vance, who had finally lost her mind. I didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, I parked 3 houses down and slipped through the wooded path that led to my backyard, a path David and I had cleared together when he was a boy. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the ground was a muddy mess. I crawled through the bushes, my good Sunday coat ruined, until I reached the back patio. The lights were on inside. I could see Chloe through the glass doors, sipping wine and talking to the officers, looking like the picture of a grieving, wronged daughter-in-law. David was nowhere to be seen. I knew the back door was locked, but there was a loose cellar window I'd been meaning to fix for years. I prayed David hadn't gotten around to it. I knelt in the mud, tugged at the frame, and it gave way with a soft groan. I slid inside, the smell of damp earth and old coal dust greeting me. I crept up the cellar stairs, my heart in my throat. I reached the kitchen door and waited for the voices to move toward the front of the house. As soon as the hallway was clear, I darted toward the study. The family portrait, a beautiful oil painting of Arthur, David, and me, hung on the far wall. I reached behind the frame, my fingers searching for a latch, a seam, anything. My pulse was a frantic rhythm in my ears. Please, Arthur, let me find it, I prayed. Suddenly, my fingers hit a small, recessed button in the wood paneling. There was a faint click, and a section of the wall swung open a fraction of an inch. I pulled it wide, revealing a small steel box. But just as my hand closed, the 2 police officers moved into the study with practiced efficiency, their hands resting near their holsters. The room, which had always been a sanctuary of leather books and warm memories, suddenly felt like a cage. Ma'am, set the box down on the desk and step away, the older officer commanded. His name tag read Miller, and he looked like a man who had seen too many family squabbles turn ugly. I didn't move. I felt the cold steel of the box beneath my fingers. The last gift from a husband who had seen the future more clearly than I ever could. "This box belongs to me," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. It was hidden in a wall that my husband built. My son and his wife are trying to frame me for a theft that never happened, so they can keep the money they've already stolen from my retirement accounts. And Chloe let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. "David, she's delusional. Officer, she's been like this since the wedding. We tried to help her. We gave her a place to stay. And this is how she repays us, by breaking in and stealing my family's jewelry." She pointed a manicured finger at the box. "The diamonds are in there. I know it." Officer Miller looked at David. "Is that true, sir? Is that her box or your wife S?" David looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to just give up, to disappear quietly so his life could be easy again. But then he looked at Chloe, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He was more afraid of losing her than he was of losing his soul. It's Chloe's," David lied, his voice cracking. "My mom isn't well, officer. She's been confused lately. The betrayal hit me harder than the rain ever could. My own son had just labeled me confused to a policeman to cover for his wife's greed." Officer Miller stepped forward and took the box from my hands. I didn't resist. I couldn't. I felt hollowed out. He placed the box on Arthur's old mahogany desk and flipped the latch. Chloe leaned in, a triumphant smile beginning to form on her lips. But as the lid creaked open, her smile froze. There were no diamonds. There were no rings. Inside the box was a single yellowed envelope addressed to the county sheriff, and a small, antique skeleton key tied to a piece of red twine. Officer Miller pulled out the envelope. "This looks like a legal deposition," he muttered, frowning. He opened it and began to read. As his eyes moved down the page, his expression shifted from suspicion to grim realization. He looked up at David, then at Chloe, who was now backing away toward the door. "Mr. Vance," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave. "According to this document, which is notarized and sealed, your father kept a secondary set of books regarding the family business. And there's a note here about a life insurance policy you claimed 5 years ago." My heart stopped. I knew about the life insurance, but David told me it had been tied up in probate and eventually denied. "Is there a problem, officer?" David asked, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "The problem," Miller said, holding up a second paper from the envelope, "is that this document claims the policy was paid out in full to a private account in your name 3 years ago, an account your mother never knew existed." The room went silent. David turned to Chloe, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the antique skeleton key on the desk, her face pale. I realized then that the box wasn't just a failsafe. It was a trap Arthur had set for whoever tried to hurt me. But the trap had a second lock, and the key on the desk didn't fit the box. It fit something else in the house. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. We all spun around as Marcus, Chloe's father, stumbled into the room, his forehead bruised and his expensive suit covered in storage unit dust. He was breathing hard, and in his hand, he held a heavy iron fireplace poker he'd grabbed from the den. "Give me that box," Marcus hissed, ignoring the police officers entirely. "You have no idea what you've started, Mildred." For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin. Marcus stood in the doorway, the fireplace poker trembling in his hand, looking like a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. The two officers immediately drew their weapons. "Drop the weapon. Now," Miller shouted. Marcus didn't drop it. He stared at the skeleton key on the desk with an intensity that bordered on madness. "That key doesn't belong to her," Marcus snarled, his voice rasping. "Arthur stole that from my family's estate years ago. It's the key to the ledger." "Marcus, stop." Chloe screamed, but there was a note of panic in her voice, not for her father's safety, but for what he might reveal. In the chaos, I saw David move, not toward me and not toward the police. He moved toward the desk, reaching for the envelope the officer had been reading. He wanted to destroy the evidence of the life insurance payout, but as he lunged, Marcus swung the poker, not at the officers, but at the desk lamp, plunging the room into near-total darkness as the bulb shattered. Shouting erupted. I felt a hand grab my arm and pull me roughly toward the corner of the room. I thought it was Marcus, and I prepared to scream, but a familiar scent reached me, Old Spice and peppermint. It was David. "Mom, move," he hissed in my ear. He wasn't acting like the cold stranger on the porch anymore. He sounded like my son again, terrified and desperate. He pushed me toward the small servant's door behind the bookshelves, a door we used to use for hide and seek. "David, what are you doing?" I whispered, stumbling into the dark, narrow passage. "They're going to kill each other, Mom," David gasped, his voice shaking. "Marcus is in deep with some bad people. He used my dad's old patents as collateral for a loan, and now that the patents are being contested, they're coming for him. He thinks whatever that key opens will save him. Get out of the house. Go to the neighbors." "Come with me," I pleaded, reaching for his hand in the dark. "I can't. I signed the papers, Mom. I'm just as guilty as he is. I took the insurance money because Chloe said we needed it to start our life. I didn't know she was giving it to her father." A sob broke from his throat. "I'm so sorry. Just go." He slammed the servant's door shut, locking it from the study side. I was trapped in the walls of my own home. I could hear the muffled sounds of a struggle, the heavy thud of bodies hitting furniture, the officers shouting for backup, and the high-pitched, jagged screaming of Chloe. I felt my way through the dark passage, my fingers tracing the studs and wires. This passage led to the attic, but there was a small observation vent that looked down into the master bedroom, the room Chloe had taken over. I climbed the narrow stairs, my lungs burning and pressed my eye to the vent. The bedroom was empty, but the closet door was hanging open. Inside, I saw a small, floor-standing safe I'd never seen before. It wasn't the family safe. It was Marcus's, and sitting right on top of it was a black leather bag, packed and ready to go. I realized then that Chloe and Marcus weren't just trying to kick me out. They were planning to flee the country, and they were going to leave David behind to take the fall for the fraud, the theft, and the missing money. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open. It was Chloe. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was calm, cold, and moving with a terrifying purpose. She went straight to the closet, grabbed the black bag, and then stopped. She looked up at the vent, her eyes locking onto mine through the slats. She smiled, a slow, wicked curve of the lips. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small remote. "Goodbye, Mildred," she whispered. She pressed the button, and a heavy, mechanical hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. She wasn't just leaving, she was locking down the house. Steel shutters began to roll down over every window and door. We were being sealed in. The sound of the steel shutters slamming into place was like the tolling of a funeral bell. One by one, the faint glimmers of moonlight and street lamps disappeared, leaving the house in total, suffocating darkness. I was still trapped in the narrow crawlspace behind the master bedroom, the air growing thick with dust and the smell of old insulation. "David," I screamed, banging my fists against the wooden slats of the vent. "David, she's locking us in." But the walls were thick, and the chaos downstairs was too loud. I could hear Chloe's footsteps clicking across the hardwood floor as she hurried out of the bedroom. She was heading for the hidden garage exit, the only one that wouldn't be blocked by the security shutters she'd installed without my knowledge. I had to move. I scrambled back down the narrow stairs toward the study, but the servant's door was still locked from the other side. I was a prisoner in the skeleton of my own home. I sat down on the bottom step, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt the iron key Arthur had left me still clutched in my hand. He had left it for me. He had known this house better than anyone. I remembered something Arthur used to say when he was working on the renovations. "Millie, a house is like a person. It has its secrets, but it always has a back way out if you know where the heart is." The heart of the house. Arthur always called the furnace room the heart. I felt along the floor of the passage. There, beneath a loose piece of carpet, was a small brass ring. I pulled it, and a trapdoor creaked open, leading down into the crawlspace above the basement. I lowered myself into the darkness, the smell of copper and oil getting stronger. I crawled through the joists, my knees scraping against the wood, until I was directly above the furnace room. I dropped down onto the concrete floor, landing hard. The house felt different down here, vibrating with a low-frequency hum. I looked around the room. It was filled with Arthur's old tools, neatly organized on pegboards. But in the corner, behind the water heater, was a small, unassuming wooden cabinet. It was the only thing in the room that had a lock. I stepped toward it, my hand trembling as I held up the skeleton key. It fit perfectly. I turned the key, and the cabinet door swung open. Inside was a large, leather-bound ledger, the one Marcus had mentioned. But tucked into the back of the ledger was something else. A set of audio tapes and a small, handheld recorder. I pressed play on the first tape. April 14, 1999. Arthur's voice filled the room, sounding tired and older than I remembered. Marcus came to me today. He thinks I don't know he's been skimming from the patent royalties. He's in deep with some local developers, and he's using David's future as a bargaining chip. If anything happens to me, I've left a trail. But I've also left a debt Marcus will do anything to erase. The tape hissed for a moment before continuing. The house isn't just a home, Mildred. It's the proof. Marcus thinks the documents are in the study, but the real contracts, the ones with his actual signature, are stored in the foundation, under the third pillar. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs was kicked open. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, swinging wildly until it landed on me. I knew you'd find the heart, Mildred, Marcus's voice echoed down the stairs. He was leaning against the doorframe, blood trickling down his face, the fireplace poker still in his hand. He looked like a wounded animal, but the heart is about to stop beating. He started down the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Where is the ledger? Give it to me, and I might let you out before the police find a way through those shutters. I looked at the third pillar. It was only 5 feet away. But Marcus was closing the distance, and the look in his eyes told me he didn't plan on letting anyone leave this house alive. I backed away from the cabinet, clutching the ledger to my chest like a shield. Marcus was halfway down the stairs now, his breathing heavy and ragged. The flashlight in his hand cast long, distorted shadows against the concrete walls, making him look like a monster from a nightmare. You don't want to do this, Marcus, I said, my voice shaking but loud. The police are upstairs. They've already seen the documents from the box. It's over. The police are busy trying to get through 6 inches of reinforced steel Chloe put on the doors. Marcus sneered, his eyes darting to the ledger. By the time they get in, this basement will have had a gas leak, a tragic accident. A grieving son and his wife will inherit everything, and the meddling mother-in-law will be a memory. Now, give me the book. I looked at the third pillar Arthur had mentioned. It was a heavy, brick-clad support beam that held up the center of the house. Near the base, I saw a small, discolored brick that didn't quite match the others. Is that what you're looking for? I pointed at the pillar, trying to distract him. Marcus turned his head for a split second, his greed overriding his caution. That was all the time I needed. I didn't run for the stairs. I knew he'd catch me. Instead, I grabbed a heavy can of wood sealant from Arthur's workbench and threw it at the light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room plunged into darkness. Marcus roared in frustration, the beam of his flashlight swinging wildly. I dove behind the furnace, the cold metal pressing against my back. I could hear his heavy footsteps on the concrete, the metallic clink of the poker hitting the floor as he searched for me. Mildred, you can't hide forever. I crawled along the wall toward the third pillar. My fingers found the discolored brick. It was loose. I pulled it out, and behind it sat a small, fireproof pouch. I grabbed it and tucked it into my coat. Suddenly, the house shook. A muffled explosion came from somewhere upstairs, followed by the sound of grinding metal. The police were using a tactical torch to cut through the shutters. David. I heard a muffled cry from above. It was Chloe, but she sounded terrified now, not triumphant. The distraction gave Marcus away. He was standing right by the stairs, his back to me, looking up at the ceiling. I saw my chance. I didn't have the strength to fight him, but I knew this basement. I knew where Arthur kept the old floor drain, the one that always got slippery when it rained. I grabbed a gallon of linseed oil from the shelf and poured it silently across the floor between Marcus and the stairs. I'm right here, Marcus, I shouted, standing up from behind the pillar. He spun around, a snarl on his face, and lunged toward me. As his boots hit the old concrete, his feet flew out from under him. He went down hard, his head hitting the edge of the brick pillar with a sickening thud. The flashlight rolled away, flickering and dying. Marcus groaned, trying to push himself up, but he was dazed. I scrambled past him, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst through the basement door and into the hallway. The house was a war zone. Smoke was curling under the front door where the police were cutting through. I ran toward the study, hoping to find David, but the hallway was blocked by a fallen bookshelf. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic ticking coming from the kitchen pantry. I pushed open the pantry door, and my heart stopped. Taped to the main gas line was a small, homemade incendiary device, the kind Marcus must have prepared as a backup plan. The timer was glowing red. 58. 57. I had less than a minute before the house, and everyone trapped inside was blown to pieces. And then I saw David. He was slumped against the kitchen island, his leg twisted at a wrong angle, clutching his stomach. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. David, we have to go. I ran to him, trying to pull him up. Mom. She took the keys, David gasped, his face white with pain. She locked the inner security door. We're trapped in the kitchen. I looked at the timer. 42, part 10. The red numbers on the timer felt like they were burning into my eyes. 38. I looked at the heavy steel door that now separated the kitchen from the rest of the house. Chloe had thought of everything except the fact that I knew every inch of this house's history. David, listen to me, I said, grabbing his face so he had to look at me. The old milk chute. Do you remember where it is? David's eyes were glassy. The what? The milk chute, behind the pantry shelves. Back in the 50s, before the house was renovated, there was a small opening where the milkman would leave bottles. It had been covered by drywall, but the exterior small door was still there, hidden behind the ivy on the back of the house. I dragged David toward the pantry, my muscles screaming with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I began tearing boxes of cereal and canned goods off the shelves. 25. Mom, it's too small, David groaned, trying to help, but collapsing back onto the floor. You're going first, I commanded. I found the outline of the old chute. I grabbed a heavy meat tenderizer from the counter and started smashing through the drywall. Dust filled the air, making me cough, but I didn't stop. 15. The wood gave way. I saw a glimmer of the wet night air through the small exterior door. I pushed the door open. Go, David. Slide through. Not without you. I'm right behind you. Move. I shoved him toward the opening. He screamed in pain as his injured leg scraped through, but he made it, tumbling onto the wet grass outside. I turned back to the timer. 0, 8. I scrambled into the chute, my coat getting caught on a jagged piece of wood. I lurched forward, feeling the fabric tear. I tumbled out of the opening, and the man in the dark suit walked with a calculated, predatory rhythm across the rain-slicked grass. The orange glow of the burning house reflected in his eyes, making him look like something born from the fire itself. I felt David stiffen beside me, his breath hitching. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of terror. That's not one of Marcus's investors. That's the man, Chloe said, was her legal consultant from Chicago. I realized then that the web was much larger than a greedy daughter-in-law and a desperate father. This was professional. The man reached into his jacket, but he didn't pull out a gun, at least, not yet. He pulled out a small, high-powered radio. The asset is secure, he said into the device, his eyes never leaving ours. But the woman has the ledger. Permission to terminate and recover. My blood ran cold. The asset had to be Chloe, and the ledger was the book I was clutching to my chest. They weren't just fleeing, they were cleaning up the evidence, and I was the biggest piece of evidence left. I looked at David, who was trying to stand on his mangled leg, his face contorted in agony. We were sitting ducks in the middle of a wide-open lawn. The cellar, I breathed, grabbing David's arm. The old coal tunnel, David. It leads under the garden to the neighbor's tool shed. Mom, I can't walk, David groaned, his eyes filling with tears of frustration and shame. Then you crawl, David. You crawl like you did when you were a baby, because I am not losing you to these people. I hauled him up, his weight nearly crushing my small frame. We ducked behind the burning remains of the kitchen porch, the heat singeing the hair on the back of my neck. The man in the suit began to run, realizing we were slipping away. We reached the heavy iron grate of the old coal chute, hidden beneath a pile of ornamental rocks I'd placed there years ago. I kicked at the rocks, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man was only 30 feet away now. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a suppressed pistol. Phut! A bullet hissed past my ear, striking the oak tree with a dull thud. I heaved the grate open and practically shoved David into the dark, narrow hole. I scrambled in after him, pulling the grate shut just as a second bullet sparked against the iron. We tumbled down a steep, soot-covered slide, landing in a cramped, airless tunnel that smelled of 100 years of forgotten winters. Above us, we heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the grate. The man was trying to lift it, but it was rusted shut from the inside once the latch clicked. We were safe for a minute, but we were buried alive in a tunnel that hadn't been used since the Great Depression. I felt around in the dark until my hand hit a cold wooden beam. "David, give me the phone," I whispered. "The light. I need the light." David handed me Chloe's phone. I turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing something that made me scream. It wasn't a skeleton or a ghost. It was another steel box, identical to the one in the study, but this one was covered in fresh mud. Someone had been down here recently. Someone who knew about Arthur's secrets. And that someone had left a note taped to the top of the box in handwriting I recognized instantly. It was Chloe S. Part 12. I stared at the note, the ink smudged by the dampness of the tunnel. "Marcus, I found it. The patents aren't in the study. They were always under the house. I'm taking the originals. If you're reading this, I'm already at the border. Good luck with the fire." The betrayal was a bottomless pit. Chloe hadn't just used David. She had been planning to betray her own father from the very beginning. She had used Marcus's obsession with the ledger as a distraction while she hunted for the real prize, the original patent filings that were worth tens of millions in the tech industry. "She's gone, Mom," David whispered, staring at the empty mud print where the box had been. "She never loved me. She never even loved her own father. It was all a game." "We don't have time for your heart to break, David," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I was tired of being the victim, tired of watching my son cry over a woman who had tried to cremate us alive. "We have to get to the end of this tunnel. If she has the patents, she has the power to disappear forever. But I still have the ledger, and the ledger proves those patents were illegally transferred." We began to crawl through the narrow space, the ceiling so low that the soot rubbed off on our backs. David's breathing was a jagged, wet sound. He was losing a lot of blood from the gash on his leg. I kept the flashlight pointed forward, searching for the wooden door that led up into the neighbor's shed. Suddenly, the phone in my hand began to vibrate. It was a video call. The ID didn't show a name, just a string of zeros. I swiped to answer, and Chloe's face appeared on the screen. She was in a car, the interior dark, her face lit by the dashboard lights. She looked calm, almost bored. "I saw the explosion, Mildred," she said, her voice smooth. "I assume you're currently suffocating in that charming little tunnel. It's a shame, really. I actually liked that house, but Marcus was getting sloppy. And David, well, David was always a temporary solution. The police are looking for you, Chloe, I spat, my voice echoing in the confined space. And I have the ledger. I have the proof that you and your father forged Arthur's signature. Chloe laughed, a cold, tinkling sound. The ledger. You mean the one that's currently in a house that's burning to the ground. Good luck proving it exists. And as for the police, I'm already 5 miles out. By the time they clear the rubble, I'll be on a private flight. You forgot one thing, Chloe, I said, a slow, grim satisfaction spreading through my chest. You're talking to me on your phone. The one I took from the cellar. Chloe's expression didn't change at first. Then her eyes widened. She looked down at the dashboard of her car, then back at the camera. You bitch. The GPS is active, Chloe. I've already sent the link to the sheriff. Every police car in 3 counties knows exactly where you are. In the background of the call, I heard the faint, rising wail of a siren. Chloe's head snapped toward her rearview mirror. You think this stops it? She hissed. My partners won't let me get caught. They'll kill you before you ever reach the surface. The call cut out. A second later, a massive explosion rocked the tunnel. The man in the suit had tossed a grenade into the coal grate behind us. The ceiling began to collapse, heavy timbers and dirt raining down on us. Mom, David screamed as a beam fell across his back, pinning him to the tunnel floor. Dust and grit filled my mouth and lungs. I was coughed, blinded by the debris. David, I screamed, lunging through the darkness. The flashlight had fallen, but it was still shining, its beam pointing toward the wall. David was trapped from the waist down under a massive oak support beam. His face was twisted in agony, his fingers clawing at the dirt. Go, Mom. The tunnel is coming down, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I am not leaving you. I grabbed a smaller piece of wood and tried to lever the beam off him, but it didn't budge. Above us, the earth continued to groan. The weight of the house's foundation was shifting, and we were directly in the path of the sinkhole. I looked around frantically. I saw an old iron jack, a relic from when Arthur had reinforced the floors years ago. It was rusted, but it was heavy. I dragged it over, my muscles screaming, and positioned it under the beam. I pumped the handle with everything I had. Creak, groan. The beam lifted an inch. David let out a guttural cry. Again, I yelled. Creak. The beam lifted another 2 inches. David scrambled forward, dragging his mangled leg out from under the wood just as the jack snapped. The beam slammed back down, the impact sending a fresh wave of dirt into our faces. We have to move now. I pulled his arm over my shoulder. We weren't crawling anymore. We were swimming through a sea of falling earth. We reached the wooden door at the end of the tunnel. It was locked from the other side. I didn't have a key. I didn't have a tool. I only had my rage and the heavy ledger. I swung the leather-bound book with all my might against the rotted wood. Crack! I swung again and again. On the fourth strike, the wood splintered. I kicked the door open, and we tumbled into the cool, damp air of the neighbor's gardening shed. We lay there on the dirt floor, gasping for breath, surrounded by lawnmowers and bags of fertilizer. Through the shed's small window, I could see my house. It was a skeletal ruin, the roof caving in, the fire finally being brought under control by the fire department. But then I saw him, the man in the suit. He was walking toward the shed, his suppressed pistol raised. He had seen us exit. He was moving slowly, confidently. He knew we had nowhere left to run. "David," I whispered, looking around the shed. "Is there any gas in those mowers?" "Mom, what are you doing?" "He's coming to finish the job, David. And I am tired of running." I found a can of gasoline and a box of matches. I didn't have time to be a classy grandma. I was a mother protecting her cub. I poured the gasoline in a wide arc across the entrance of the shed, right under the door. The man reached the door. He didn't knock. He kicked it open. As he stepped into the shed, his eyes narrowed in the darkness. I stood at the back, holding a lit match. "You should have stayed in Chicago," I said. I dropped the match. The gasoline ignited with a roar, a wall of blue and orange flame erupting between us and the assassin. The man screamed as the fire caught his trousers. He stumbled back, firing blindly into the shed. One bullet shattered a pot next to my head, but the smoke was too thick for him to aim. He fell back into the grass, rolling to put out the flames. I didn't wait. I grabbed the ledger and David, and we slipped out the back window of the shed, disappearing into the dark woods of the neighboring estate. We ran until we reached the main road, nearly a mile away. As we emerged from the tree line, a set of headlights blinded us. A car pulled over, and for a second, I thought it was Marcus or another assassin. But the door opened, and a man in a tan uniform stepped out. "Mrs. Vance, David." It was the county sheriff himself. He looked at us, covered in soot, blood, and ash, and his face softened. "We caught her. We caught Chloe at the state line. She had the patents." David collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing into his hand. "Problem. The transport vehicle carrying the female suspect. It was just rammed. We have shots fired on I-85. The sheriff's face went pale. He didn't say another word to us. He jumped back into his cruiser and tore off toward the highway, his tires screaming. I stood on the side of the road, holding my broken son, realizing that the nightmare wasn't over. Chloe hadn't just been working for Marcus or a small-time Chicago firm. She was part of something much bigger, someone who wouldn't let her go to jail and talk. "We have to go, David," I said, pulling him toward the shadows. "If they're attacking a police transport, they're coming back for the ledger." "Mom, just give it to them," David moaned, his fever rising from the infection in his leg. "Let them have it. It's cursed. It's killed Dad. It killed Marcus. And it's going to kill us." "It didn't kill your father, David," I said, my voice cold. Your father lived for the truth. This book is his voice, and I won't let them silence him again. We couldn't stay on the road. I dragged David back into the woods, heading toward the old quarry. It was a place David used to play as a boy, a maze of granite pits and rusted machinery. It was the only place I knew where we could hide until morning. As we reached the edge of the quarry, the moon came out from behind the clouds, illuminating the deep, dark water at the bottom of the pit. We sat behind a rusted crane, the cold stone biting into my skin. I opened the ledger to the very last page. There, tucked into a hidden pocket in the leather, was a small micro SD card. I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a way to see what was on it. But I knew it was the final piece of the puzzle. Arthur had been a genius, but he was also a man who understood the value of insurance. Suddenly, the sound of a drone humming overhead cut through the silence. A red laser dot appeared on the crane above our heads. They were using thermal imaging. They had found us. Run, I yelled, pulling David toward the narrow stairs that led down into the pit. Phut, phut. Bullets sparked against the granite steps. We scrambled down, the darkness of the pit, our only hope. We reached a small cave at the water's edge, the air smelling of moss and damp earth. I pushed David inside and stood at the entrance, holding a heavy piece of jagged granite. The drone hovered outside, its red eye searching. Then a voice boomed from a speaker on the drone. Mildred Vance, you are holding property that belongs to the Vanguard Corporation. Hand over the card, and your son gets the medical attention he needs. You have 60 seconds. Vanguard, David whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Mom, that's the company that bought Dad's old firm. They're the ones who have been funding the patent research. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The investors weren't outsiders. They were the very people who had benefited from Arthur's work for decades. They had been paying Chloe to steal back the evidence of their own corporate theft. 60 seconds, Mildred, the drone repeated. I looked at the micro SD card. Then I looked at the dark, bottomless water of the quarry. I know who you are, I shouted at the drone. And I know what's on this card. It's the original code for the encryption software you've been selling to the government. You didn't invent it, Arthur did. And you murdered him to keep the royalties. The drone went silent for a beat. Then the red light turned green. Incorrect, the voice said. We didn't murder him. Your son did. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I turned to look at David, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the water, his face a mask of absolute, crushing guilt. David, I whispered, the word feeling like a piece of lead in my mouth. What are they talking about? I didn't mean to, Mom, David sobbed, the sound echoing off the cave walls. The night Dad died, we were arguing. He found out I'd been taking money from the office to pay for my gambling debts. He said he was going to turn me in. He said I needed to learn a lesson. My heart shattered into a million pieces. He had a heart attack, David. The doctor said he was having the attack And I saw his medicine on the counter. David's voice was a jagged rasp. I didn't give it to him. I just stood there, I thought. I thought if he was gone, the problem would go away. I didn't kill him, Mom, but I let him die. The silence that followed was more painful than any explosion. My son, my baby, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, had watched his father die to save his own skin, and the Vanguard Corporation had known. They had used that knowledge to blackmail him, to turn him into their puppet, and eventually to use Chloe to infiltrate our lives and recover the evidence Arthur had hidden. He was going to give you everything, David, I whispered, the tears finally flowing freely. Everything in that ledger. He was holding it over their heads to make sure you were taken care of. He wasn't going to turn you in. He was trying to protect you from them. I didn't know. David screamed, hitting his head against the stone. I thought he hated me. The second drone didn't hesitate. It was a sleek, military-grade shadow against the moon. And as the police spotlights hit the ridge, it released a small, metallic cylinder. I expected an explosion, another roar of fire. But instead, a blinding hiss of white smoke erupted at the mouth of our cave. It was a high-density tear gas, thick and burning, designed to flush us out into the open where the Vanguard consultants could intercept us before the sheriff reached the bottom of the pit. Mom, I can't breathe. David coughed, his voice breaking into a panicked wheeze. He was clawing at the cave floor, the smoke filling the small space within seconds. I felt the sting in my eyes, 1,000 needles pricking my throat, but I gripped his collar. I had the truth inside me now, literally, and I knew that if we stayed here, we were dead. If we went out the front, we were captured. The water, David, I choked out, pointing to the dark, freezing edge of the quarry pool. We have to swim to the old pump station. I can't, the leg. You will swim or you will die. I dragged him toward the ledge. The water was black and looked bottomless, but it was the only way to bypass the gas and the shooters on the ridge. We plunged in together. The cold was a physical blow, a hammer to the chest that stole my breath. I felt David's weight pulling me down as he struggled, but the adrenaline of a mother's desperation gave my old bones a strength they hadn't possessed in decades. We surfaced 30 yards away, hidden by the thick fog of the tear gas. I looked back and saw silhouettes emerging from the smoke, men in tactical gear, moving with silent, lethal precision. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for a body to harvest. We reached the rusted ladder of the old pump station, a corrugated metal shack built onto the side of the cliff. I hauled David up, both of us shivering violently, our teeth chattering like castanets. Inside the shack, it smelled of grease and stagnant water. I found a heavy iron bolt and slid it across the door just as a bullet pinged off the metal exterior. "They're coming, Mom," David whispered, huddling in the corner. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and a new, terrible realization. "You swallowed it. You actually swallowed it." They're going to cut you open, aren't they? I looked at my hands, wrinkled and blue from the cold. They can try, David. But while they're busy with me, you're going to do something you should have done a long time ago. I reached into my wet pocket and pulled out the one thing I hadn't lost in the water, the antique skeleton key from the box. This isn't just for a ledger cabinet, David. Your father told me once that the pump station was the fail-safe for the whole estate's digital footprint. There's a manual override here. It broadcasts a raw signal to every local news station if the security is breached. Suddenly, the roof of the shack groaned. Someone was on top of us. A heavy thud echoed above, followed by the sound of a circular saw biting into the metal. Sparks showered down on us like angry stars. The screech of the saw was a physical pain in my ears. The men from Vanguard were cutting through the roof, and they weren't being quiet anymore. They knew the police were closing in, and they were willing to take the risk to get to me before the sheriff reached this side of the quarry. David, the panel. Under the desk, I pointed to a rusted, gray box bolted to the wall. David scrambled over, his injured leg leaving a dark trail on the floor. He tore the cover off, revealing an ancient-looking keyboard and a series of toggle switches. It's asking for a physical authentication, he gasped, his fingers flying. Mom, it needs the key. I pressed the skeleton key into his hand. Do it, now. He jammed the key into the slot and turned it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the entire shack began to thrum with power. A hidden antenna on the roof extended, and a green light on the console began to blink. Uploading. Uploading what? David asked, his voice shaking. The secondary backup, I said. The card I swallowed was the code. But the server hidden in this pump station has the video files. The ones of Marcus and the Vanguard executives talking about the disposal of your father. The saw finally breached the roof. A 3-foot section of metal plate fell to the floor with a deafening crash. A man in a gas mask dropped down, his weapon raised. I didn't think. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench and swung. I didn't hit him, but I knocked his aim off just as he fired. The bullet hit the power console, sending a spray of sparks into the air. David screamed as the console erupted in a small fire. The upload. It's only at 40%. The man in the mask kicked me aside, his boot hitting my ribs with a force that made my vision go black. He grabbed my throat, his gloved hand squeezing. Where is the card, Mildred? His voice was muffled, mechanical through the mask. She threw it in the water. David shouted, lunging at the man's waist. The assassin shifted his weight, slamming David against the wall with his elbow. He turned his attention back to me, pulling a long, serrated knife from his belt. I don't believe him. I think you're more sentimental than that. He leaned in, the tip of the blade touching the skin of my throat. I could see my own reflection in his goggles, a tired, broken old woman, but behind him, I saw the green light on the console. 60%. 70%. The police are 10 seconds away, I wheezed, staring him in the eyes. You're going to be on the news before you even get out of this pit. The man paused, hearing the roar of the sheriff's helicopters directly above the shack. The searchlights flooded through the hole in the roof, blinding him. He looked up, his jaw tightening. He had a choice: finish me and get caught, or run. He chose a third option. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me toward the hole in the roof. If I'm going down, the hard drive comes with me. I felt the cold air hit my face as the assassin hauled me up onto the roof of the shack. The wind from the helicopter blades was a hurricane, whipping my wet hair across my face. Below us, the quarry was a sea of blue and red lights. The sheriff was screaming into a megaphone, but the noise of the rotors drowned him out. Let her go. David's voice came from the hole in the roof. He was trying to climb out, his face pale with exertion. The assassin didn't look at him. He was looking at a dark, unmarked helicopter that was descending from the opposite side of the ridge, the Vanguard extraction team. He hooked a carabiner to my coat, tethering me to himself. We were going to be hoisted out, and I knew that once I was in that black helicopter, I would never be seen again. David, stay back, I yelled, but David didn't stay back. He reached the edge of the roof, and in his hand, he held the glowing power cable he'd ripped from the console. You want the truth? David roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, fierce clarity. The truth is, I'm my father's son. He lunged forward, not at the man, but at the metal hoist the assassin was holding. He jammed the live cable against the winch. A massive arc of electricity surged through the metal. The assassin let out a horrific, muffled scream as the current tore through his body. Because he was tethered to me, I felt a jolt that felt like my heart was being turned inside out. But my thick, rubber-soled garden boots, the ones I'd put on in the cellar, saved me from the full brunt of the shock. The man collapsed, his grip on me loosening. We both slid off the slanted roof of the shack. I felt myself falling, the world spinning. I hit the water again, but this time I wasn't alone. The assassin's body hit the surface like a stone, sinking instantly. I struggled to the surface, gasping for air, my heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. I looked up. David was leaning over the edge of the roof, the sparks from the console behind him making him look like a silhouette in a dream. Mom, grab the buoy. I grabbed the orange ring the sheriff's team had tossed into the water. As they pulled me toward the shore, I saw the Vanguard helicopter veer away, realizing the extraction had failed. The lights of the law were everywhere now. I was pulled onto the rocky bank, blankets thrown over my shoulders. The sheriff ran over, his face etched with worry. Mildred, are you okay? Where's the evidence? I looked at him, then at the burning ruins of my home on the hill, and finally at David, who was being lowered from the shack by 2 officers. He looked broken, but for the first time in years, he looked me in the eye. It's safe, Sheriff, I whispered. It's all safe, but I need to go to the hospital. I have something to deliver. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I saw a familiar car parked at the edge of the police cordon. A silver Mercedes. The door opened, and Chloe stepped out, handcuffed, her face a mask of fury as she watched me. She leaned toward the officer holding her and whispered something. The officer's expression changed instantly. He looked at me, then at the ambulance, and reached for his radio. The ambulance sped through the dark Georgia backroads, its sirens a constant morning wail. I lay on the gurney, my body shaking with the onset of hypothermia, while a young EMT checked my vitals. David was sitting on a small bench next to me, holding my hand so tight his knuckles were white. "You're going to be okay, Mom," he kept saying. But he was saying it more for himself than for me. "The doctors will get the card out. We'll testify. It's over." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I couldn't forget the look on that officer's face when Chloe spoke to him. Vanguard didn't just have consultants and assassins. They had people in uniforms. "David," I whispered, pulling him closer. "The EMT, look at his badge." David frowned and glanced at the young man who was preparing an IV. The name on the badge was Miller, the same as the officer from the house. But this man looked nothing like him. In fact, his hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a strange, cold intensity. He wasn't looking at my vitals, he was looking at the cardiac monitor. "Wait," David said, his voice dropping. "That's not the hospital route. We should have turned at the bypass." The EMT didn't look up. He reached for a syringe and a small vial of clear liquid. "There's a road closure, sir. This is a shortcut." "No, it isn't," I said, my voice gaining strength. "This is the road to the old timber mill. There's nothing there but forest." The EMT finally looked up. His eyes were cold, devoid of any of the care a medic should have. "Mrs. Vance, you've caused a lot of people a lot of trouble. The card you swallowed. It's a very expensive piece of plastic. We'd prefer to get it back without damaging it, but we're on a schedule." He lunged forward with the syringe. David roared and threw himself across me, grabbing the man's arm. The two of them crashed into the back doors of the ambulance. The vehicle swerved violently as the driver reacted to the struggle. "Mom, get out," David yelled, pinning the man's wrist against the metal frame. "The side door. Jump. I'm not leaving you. Gio, if they get us both, nobody knows the truth." The ambulance slammed into a tree, the impact throwing me forward. The side door burst open from the force. I rolled out into the wet grass, the world spinning. I heard the sound of a struggle inside the van, a muffled shout, and then silence. I scrambled to my feet, my ribs screaming in pain. I looked back at the wrecked ambulance. The driver was stepping out, a silenced pistol in his hand. He didn't look at me. He went straight to the back doors. I ran. I didn't have a choice. I ran into the thick Georgia pines, the thorns tearing at my skin. I could hear them behind me, the heavy crunch of boots on dry needles. I reached a small clearing where an old hunting stand stood, a rickety wooden tower. I began to climb. As I reached the top, I saw a flash of light in the distance. Another car, but it wasn't a police car. It was the silver Mercedes. Chloe had escaped. I huddled in the dark of the hunting stand, my breath coming in short, sharp hitches. From this height, I could see the road. The ambulance was a crumpled heap against an oak tree, its lights still flickering weakly. I saw the driver and the EMT pulling a limp figure from the back. It was David. They threw him onto the ground like a sack of grain. My heart nearly stopped. Please, let him be alive, I prayed. Please, Arthur, help him. The silver Mercedes pulled up beside them. Chloe stepped out, no longer in handcuffs. She stood over David, looking down at him with a coldness that made the midnight air feel like a summer day. She said something to the men, and they began to lift David toward the trunk of the car. I'm right here, I screamed, standing up in the tower. I couldn't let them take him. I couldn't let him be the final sacrifice for my husband's secrets. I have the card. Leave HIM alone. The three of them looked up. Chloe's face twisted into a smile that wasn't human. She pointed at the tower. Get her, she commanded, and bring me the boy's phone. I want to see her face when she realizes she lost. The two men began to run toward the stand. I looked around the small wooden platform. There was nothing here, just an old rusted coffee tin and some discarded fishing line. I was trapped. But then I felt something in the pocket of my wet coat. The small, handheld recorder from the furnace room. I hadn't even checked if it worked after the swim. I pulled it out and hit the play button. Arthur's voice filled the small space, but it wasn't the recording from before. It was a loop of a high-pitched digital frequency. Beep, 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 beep. It was a tracker. Arthur hadn't just left me a message, he'd left me a beacon. And as the men reached the base of the ladder, the entire forest floor was suddenly illuminated by a light so bright it felt like the sun had fallen from the sky. It wasn't a helicopter. It was a fleet of drones, but these weren't vanguards. They were marked with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents, drop your weapons and get on the ground. A voice boomed from the sky. Chloe froze. She looked at the drones, then at the forest, realizing she was surrounded. The two men at the base of my ladder put their hands up immediately. They were professionals. They knew when the game was up. But Chloe wasn't a professional. She was a woman who had gambled everything on a lie. She lunged toward the Mercedes, reaching for something in the glove box. Chloe, don't. I screamed from the tower. A single shot rang out from the tree line. Chloe spun around. Her shoulder, I stared at Sila's, my breath hitching in my chest. Sila's was the older brother Arthur had always looked up to, the one who had disappeared from our lives so abruptly that I'd been forced to accept the story of a tragic accident. Seeing him now, gray-haired and weathered, but but very much alive. Felt like the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. Silas, I whispered, my voice lost in the hum of the FBI drones above. How? Arthur told me you were gone. Silas walked toward me, his cane thumping softly on the damp forest floor. He reached out a calloused hand and helped me to my feet, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful kindness. Arthur had to tell you that, Millie. He had to tell everyone. It was the only way to keep the Vanguard dogs off my scent while I worked on the encryption from the outside. We were the two halves of the same key. David sat up slowly, wincing as an FBI medic began to wrap his leg. He looked at Silas with a mixture of awe and confusion. You've been alive this whole time, while everything was falling apart. I've been watching David, Silas said, looking at his nephew with a stern but fatherly gaze. I saw the mistakes you made. I saw how you let that woman lead you by the nose. And I saw the night your father died. David flinched, his head dropping in shame. The weight of his confession in the quarry was still hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. Arthur knew you were standing there, David, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He knew you didn't give him the medicine. But what you don't know is that he'd already hidden the real files. He chose to let the attack take him because he knew that as long as he was alive, Vanguard would never stop using you to get to him. He died to set you free from the blackmail, son. He made himself the sacrifice so you wouldn't have to be a pawn anymore. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He let out a long, shuddering sob, burying his face in his hands. He hadn't just failed his father. He had misunderstood his father's final act of love. Special Agent Vance stepped forward, checking his watch. The medical transport is here. We need to get Mildred to the facility to retrieve the microSD. And Chloe. He glanced over at the woman being loaded into a separate police cruiser, her shoulder bandaged, and her eyes burning with a silent, trapped fury. Chloe has a long date with a federal prosecutor. But she isn't the head of the snake. The CEO of Vanguard is currently attempting to board a private jet in Savannah. He won't make it, I said, my voice cold. I felt the hard edges of the card still within me, the physical weight of the truth. Not if Silas has what I think he has. Silas nodded, tapping his cane against the old truck. I have the receiver, but we need the source code from that card to bypass the final firewall. If we don't get it in the next hour, the Vanguard servers will auto-delete every shred of evidence regarding the patent thefts and the murders. We had won the battle in the woods, but the war was coming down to a matter of minutes. As they helped me into the back of the FBI Suburban, I looked at the dark tree line. A single pair of headlights flickered once, then vanished. Someone else was watching. The FBI medical facility was a sterile, high-security bunker hidden beneath an unassuming office park. They didn't have time for a standard digestive wait. They needed the card immediately. I lay on the procedure table. The bright lights overhead reminding me of the wedding chapel where I'd stood only 6 months ago, watching my son pledge his life to a monster. The procedure was quick but invasive, an endoscopic retrieval that left me feeling hollow and exhausted. As the doctor pulled the small, blackened piece of plastic from the retrieval net, Agent Vance and Silas were already standing by with a high-speed terminal. "Is it damaged?" I rasped, my throat sore from the scope. "It's fireproof, waterproof, and apparently stomach acid proof," Silas muttered, his fingers dancing across a keyboard with a speed that defied his age. Arthur was a paranoid genius, Millie. Thank God for that. The screen in the room began to scroll through thousands of lines of green code. Suddenly, a window popped up. Encryption bypass complete. Accessing Vanguard core servers, wherein Agent Vance breathed. Images began to fill the monitors. Not just documents, but surveillance footage from the Vanguard boardrooms. I saw Marcus, younger, more desperate, shaking hands with a man in a tailored suit. I saw the contracts that proved Arthur had been the sole inventor of the technology that now powered half the world's communication systems. But then, a final file opened. It was a recent recording, dated only 2 days ago. I saw my own living room. I saw Chloe and Marcus sitting on my sofa, the very one I'd picked out with Arthur. They were talking to a man on a video screen, the CEO of Vanguard. "The mother is the only variable left." The CEO's voice came through the speakers. "If David can't get her to sign the final quitclaim deed, we can't sell the estate to the developers. And if the estate isn't sold, the hidden vault remains under her legal protection. Do whatever is necessary. If she won't sign, she becomes a liability." Then I saw David enter the room. My heart stopped. The recording showed Chloe standing up, her face instantly morphing into that of a loving, concerned wife. "David, honey," she said on the tape, "your mom is getting worse. She told me today she saw your father in the garden. I think it's time we talk about the assisted living facility Marcus mentioned. It's for her own safety." On the screen, I watched my son, my David, look at her with such trust, such vulnerability. "I just want her to be happy, Chloe," he said. "If the doctor says she needs help, I'll sign whatever you need." He hadn't been a villain. He had been a fool, blinded by a love he thought was real. I felt a wave of pity wash over me, replacing the sharp edges of my anger. Suddenly, the alarms in the FBI bunker began to blare. The monitors flickered and died. "They're counter-hacking," Silas shouted. "They're trying to wipe the facility's drives from a remote location." "They can't wipe what's already been broadcast," Silas grinned, a wild, triumphant look in his eyes. "I didn't just download it, Vance. I patched it into the National Emergency Alert System. Every television in the country just saw that board meeting." But the victory was short-lived. The heavy steel door of the lab hissed open, and a man in a tactical vest stepped in. It wasn't an agent. It was the driver from the ambulance, the one who had survived the crash. And he wasn't looking for a card anymore. He was holding a dead man's switch. The room went deathly silent. The tactical agent, his face bruised and bloody from the ambulance wreck, looked like a man who knew he was at the end of his rope. The dead man's switch in his hand was connected to a belt of high-grade explosives wrapped around his waist. "Back away from the terminal," he rasped. "Vanguard doesn't care about the footage anymore. They just want the people who can testify. If I let go of this button, this whole floor becomes a tomb." Agent Vance kept his hands visible. "You're a dead man either way, son. Vanguard won't protect you now. You're a loose end." "I'm a paid-for end," the man sneered. "My family gets 10 million if I finish this. Now out, into the hallway." He began to herd us out of the lab. I looked at David, who was leaning against the wall, his face pale, but his eyes suddenly sharp. He looked at me, then at the heavy nitrogen tank used for the lab's cooling system. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. For the first time in years, we were thinking exactly the same thing. As we passed the tank, David tripped, a deliberate, clumsy fall that sent him crashing into the manifold. The hiss of pressurized nitrogen was like a jet engine. A cloud of freezing white gas erupted, filling the narrow hallway in a second. The assassin's vision was obscured. He panicked, swinging his weapon wildly. "I'll do it. I'll let go." "Then let go," I shouted, grabbing a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and hurling it through the fog. The extinguisher hit the man in the chest, the force of it knocking him backward. He didn't let go of the switch. He couldn't. His fingers had frozen solid in the nitrogen blast. He slumped to the floor, a statue of ice and failed ambition. Vance lunged forward, pinned the man's hand to the switch with a specialized clamp, and began the frantic process of disarming the vest. "Get her out of here," Vance yelled. Silas grabbed my arm, and David grabbed the other. We ran through the maze of the bunker, emerging into the gray light of a Georgia morning. The parking lot was filled with black SUVs, news vans, and the chaos of a collapsing empire. I sat on the bumper of Silas's old truck, the cold air finally feeling like a blessing. David sat beside me, his head resting on my shoulder. For a long time, we didn't say anything. We just watched the sun climb over the trees, the same sun that had risen every morning of my life, through the good years with Arthur and the dark years of the betrayal. "Mom," David said softly. "Yes, David, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. But I'd like to try and be the man Dad thought I could be. If you'll let me." I looked at him, my son, the boy who had broken my heart and then helped me save the world. "The last time you hugged me was at your wedding, David," I said. "And it was the loneliest hug of my life." He stood up, his eyes brimming with tears, and opened his arms. This time, there was no Chloe watching. There were no secrets between us, just a mother and a son standing in the wreckage of their lives, beginning to build something new. But as we embraced, Silas cleared his throat, holding a ringing phone. "Millie, you might want to take this. It's the warden at the county jail. It's about Chloe." I took the phone with a trembling hand. "This is Mildred Vance." "Mrs. Vance," the warden's voice was clipped, professional. "I'm calling because the suspect, Chloe Vance, requested her one phone call be directed to you. She said it was a matter of unclaimed property." And I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Put her through." There was a click, a burst of static, and then that voice, the one that had haunted my dreams for months. But Chloe didn't sound defeated. She didn't sound angry. She sounded triumphant. "Do you really think it's over, Mildred?" she whispered. "Do you think a few news reports and a dead CEO change the way the world works? Vanguard was a name. The people behind it, they don't have names. They have interests. You're going to prison, Chloe," I said, my voice steady. "For a very, very long time." "Maybe," she laughed. "But remember the unclaimed property I told the warden about. Check the box again, Mildred. The one Arthur left you. Not the secret compartment. The lid. Look at the lining of the lid. The line went dead." I looked at Silas. He still had the box in the back of his truck. We ran to it, the wood scarred by the fire and the struggle. I tore at the velvet lining of the lid, my fingernails breaking against the mahogany. There, tucked into a microscopic slit in the wood, was a single, laminated photograph. It wasn't a picture of Arthur. It wasn't a picture of the house. It was a picture of a baby, a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't Arthur's and wasn't mine, were the words, "David Arthur Vance Jr., born November 14th. I looked at the date. It was 2 weeks ago. "She was pregnant," David whispered, the color draining from his face. "She never told me. She had the baby in secret." "She didn't have it in secret to protect it, David," I said, the horror dawning on me. "She had it as the ultimate insurance policy. She has an heir to the patents, to the estate, to everything Arthur built. Where is he?" David screamed at the empty air. "Where is my son?" I looked at the photograph again, in the background of the hospital room, visible only if you looked closely at the reflection in the window, was the logo of a private clinic in Switzerland. Chloe hadn't been fighting for the patents for herself. She had been fighting to secure a kingdom for a child I never knew existed, a child who was now in the hands of the very people we had just tried to destroy. "The hunt isn't over, is it?" Silas asked, his face darkening. "No," I said, standing tall, the grandma in me replaced by something far more formidable. "It's just moved to a different continent." The Alps rose up like jagged teeth against the bright blue sky of Switzerland. It had been 6 months since the fire, 6 months since the truth about Vanguard had been laid bare to the world. The company was in receivership. The CEO was in a federal prison, and the house in Georgia was being rebuilt, stone by stone, by a son who spent his days working the land and his nights studying the law. But I wasn't in Georgia. I held a legal document signed by the High Court of International Justice. Beside me stood Silas, his cane replaced by a sturdy walking stick, and Special Agent Vance, who had stayed with the case long after the cameras had moved on. "They're coming out now, Mildred," Vance said, pointing to the clinic doors. A woman in a nurse's uniform emerged, carrying a small, sleeping bundle. Behind her were two men in dark suits, the last of the old guard, the trustees, who had been appointed by Chloe to keep the child hidden. They saw us waiting at the gate. They saw the local police cars pulling into the driveway. They knew the interest they were protecting had finally run out of shadows. The nurse handed the baby to me. He was 6 months old now, with Arthur's eyes and a tuft of dark hair that reminded me so much of David as a toddler that it hurt to breathe. He looked up at me and let out a small, curious gurgle, reaching for the gold locket around my neck. "Hello, little one," I whispered, the tears finally feeling like they were washing away the last of the soot. "I'm your grandma, and you are going home." As we boarded the plane back to the States, I looked out at the clouds and thought about the journey that had brought me here. I had lost my husband, my home, and for a while, I had lost my son. I had been mocked, hunted, and thrown out into the rain. But I had learned something that no amount of money or power could ever buy. The true treasure of the elder isn't a secret ledger or a billion-dollar patent. It isn't a house on a hill or a name on a building. The treasure is the fierce, unbreakable thread of a mother's love, a love that can survive betrayal, outlast fire, and cross oceans to bring a family back together. It is the wisdom to know when to be humble and the strength to know when to be a lioness.